Well, there's a significant jump from the previous album to the famous long-faced record. I've often wondered about what happened in the time in between that created the leap from bubblegum pop, block chords backing a static melody that, albeit brilliant, ran a little like a player piano or an alarm on an old Casio watch. One note at a time, a little harmony for a real flourish. But there was something different in this one. From the first note of Drive My Car, you feel something. It's no longer a single mic dropped in the middle of a room with 4 screaming young adults, shocking people again with their wild mop tops and a stationary modification of the rebellion of Elvis's video-recorded hips. They were beyond cool. No longer trying to get people to think they were edgy because they wore wild clothes. They actually were on the edge, reinventing music at the very top, sending it down from the mountain to free up the dusty ears of the Western world and rattle some cages down on Tin Pan Alley and up at Capitol Records. Rubber Soul. The 1965 album by the Beatles was different. You could hear it. When the boys sat with the cover artist and his projector screen fell back, stretching their faces on the photo, removing baby fat and adding years onto the Fab Four, they finally looked like adults and they said, "Keep it." But what changed in that album? Certainly they had brilliant songs before. Yesterday, Ticket to Ride, even No Reply shakes me. Every time I hear it, it's genius. But something is dramatically different here. Some people might say they got new equipment, new guitars and amps from Leo Fender, crafted in his shop just a short down the 22 from right here. But there's so much more. Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man, Michelle in My Life. I go through periods of time where I can't listen to anything but this album. I put something else on and it just doesn't have that feel. The notes are in the wrong place. The harmony's too simple. The change is too contrived. Where in the world did that music come from? And why is the rabbi talking about the Beatles on Rosh HaShanah? Despite sticking to holy subjects on this holiday. Well, a few things happened for the lads from Liverpool in 1965. They met Elvis, and despite the Fab Four worshiping their king, they discovered that they intimidated him. Later on, they learned that he tried to have their music banned in the U.S. to protect his seat as number one. There were drugs, but that was not new for them. I didn't have a stop for that, but yeah. What changed was that this was the first time, the first album where they finally had real studio time. Up until then, time in the studio was limited. They, or just about anyone else, would rehearse their parts and then hop into the studio for a short block of time. Tape and personnel were so expensive, they had to rush in and set up their amps and kit and count off just in time for the engineer to stamp the record button and catch what was essentially a live performance in a smaller space. By the time the Beatles got to Rubber Soul, they were so big and influential, they could walk into the studio like they owned the place. They had all the time they wanted. They went into the back and talked to the engineers and had them crank the dials. When someone said, "You can't do that," they said, "Try it." Sometimes it didn't work. Alan Civil was not going to do any better playing French horn on Revolver later on. But when they reprocessed the guitar on Nowhere Man, by sending it through one more high-pass filter, they finally got the sound that shook the airwave for decades to come. And what was an experiment is now the standard. Expected, you could even say time-honored traditional. The studio was no longer a place to stop in once in a while and hash out the things that you needed and then take away the product and go on with your merry life. The studio became a place where you gathered. shared some time and ideas, and let innovation and recording be a byproduct of the time you spent exploring new avenues to music. So why am I talking about the Beatles on this holiday? Because we are in 1965. Now, I don't mean literally, or I would be wearing a very different suit, but we as a community are at a crossroads. For the past 10 to 20 years, the Jewish community in the United States has been in an unprecedented time. And it's now coming to the fore, and it's due to demographics. For about a century now, Jews in the U.S. have commonly sent their kids away to college or elsewhere after graduating from high school, and often in the course of their time away, they would meet someone, get married in their early 20s, and shortly thereafter have kids of their own. As soon as those kids were old enough to enter religious school, they would enroll them in a supplementary program at a synagogue that commonly became their social and spiritual home. But things have shifted. Today, young people are often waiting much longer to get married. And if they choose to have children, they wait even longer. Many begin to have children in their late 30s or early 40s, and there's potentially a quarter of a person's lifespan where they are not linked to a synagogue for the simple fact that they have no children of their own. This is new for the Jewish community. And all of the ages are mixed up because parents of adults don't have grandchildren of their own. They're also missing the connection. And ages across the spectrum are mixed up from what they looked like in the past. 65 used to be the age of retirement, and people would begin to slow down and become a homebody, and I expect to start whittling. Today, 65 is the new 40 or 30. I can't keep up with many of our members in this age group, and I am not in bad shape. And everyone is changing. 10-year-olds are acting like teenagers. They're even experiencing physical changes earlier than ever recorded, and it's baffling researchers. 28 is the new 18. 85 is the new 60. Things are changing. One of my favorite stories in the Talmud includes a little bit of magic. It takes place in that favorite location of the rabbis, the top of Mount Sinai. Moses ascends to meet God at the height of the rock, and the rabbis imagine a vaguely corporeal God like a sofer painting words of Torah with a fine white quill. As Moses reaches this peak, God is still working on the text, placing crowns on each of the letters. A shin adorned with 3 spires set on its right arm, a vav that reaches above the line in a heavenly gesture. What's puzzling to Moses is that there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or a reason to the placement of these decorations. While painted with delight, they seem not to discriminate. An olive here has one, an olive there does not. In my mind, the rabbis gave us a gift. Rather than dismissing these seemingly random letter crests, assigning them to aesthetic or the ecstatic expression of an early scribe, the rabbis invite us to go deeper. Nothing, they seem to say, has to remain meaningless. And so in their mind, Moses asks, what are these crowns? And God replies that someday there will be a great teacher, Akiva, who will draw out mountains of laws from each of these small lines. Here's where the magic comes in. Moses says, show me. And he turns around to find himself in the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom. The great sage is teaching and speaking and explaining, and Moses doesn't understand a word of it. And this is my favorite part. One of Akiva's students, they ask him, from where do we learn the particular lesson you're sharing with us? And Akiva doesn't hesitate. He says, from Moses, our teacher. Every generation of Jews has reinvented Judaism. Every single one has reimagined the teachings of our tradition and re-expressed them in their own voice. Despite the fixation of some anachronistic extremist sects of Judaism, today is not the same as it was 500 years ago. Rabbi Rashi would not understand Rabbi Heschel, just as Moses didn't understand Akiva. And while generations adjacent to one another have more in common than those divided by centuries, even they have different needs and different ways of meeting them. It is both inevitable and necessary that Judaism finds new voices, new forms. What's happening today is those generations are all finding themselves in the same house. And like the magic of the Midrash, Moses is sitting in the room with Akiva, and while neither has anything but love for the other, they don't speak the same language. I was recently watching a video interview with Rabbi Kelter from 2004. Video is so different than text. It's less intimate, but much, much more informational. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. And our dear Rabbi Emeritus was answering questions behind his thick glasses and accent. And he would sometimes pause for a moment before responding, clear that he was drawing from deep wells of wisdom, experience that taught him real reasons and repercussions for the implications of each question and answer. There is a new generation coming, he said. They need to find a new expression of Judaism. Countless times, I will speak with a member of our community who is here all of the time. For any number of reasons, this place is not only their spiritual home, it's their third space. Their spot away from work and home, and they're here all the time, stuffing envelopes or setting up for a program, learning or leading a committee or task force, and they will not know another person at Temple Israel who is also here every week, regularly involved in another project. We are a community, diverse even as we are one. I believe that we have the capacity and need to create the space for many different approaches to Judaism. There is space in this tent for different voices, different ways of leading a spiritual life. There is no need to let go of meaningful melodies and rituals that make up your practice. But know also that there is no such thing as the historical, traditional, or correct melody for a prayer. Whether you roll back the clock 5 or 50 or 150 or 1,000 years, the melodies will all be different. The holidays and rituals only distant reflections of one another. Because of this, know that what is right and familiar for you may not be for your neighbor. And even if your spiritual community might do something that is not for you personally, doesn't look like the Judaism that you are used to practicing, or is too staid, too much of a Judaism not relevant to your needs today, it does not mean that it is not your sacred home. There is more to this place than any one of us can ever see. Memories in the walls and history outside our records, potential beyond our wildest dreams. That is part of what makes it holy. Back to our favorite four. One of the things that might be surprising to see in the Beatles is that even as they were defining still new genre of rock and roll, they were sponges for any kind of music they could get their hands on. There was the usual interchange between popular bands at the time. Paul remembers sitting with Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones in his apartment and hearing one of their records before it was released, digging the new sounds as the needle grooved into the vinyl. But Blackbird is the sweet, simple acoustic guitar piece was a riff off of an etude by Bach. George spent hours listening to Indian music just to expand his sense of harmony beyond the 12 notes of our Western scale. Paul's still learning. He just played at the tribute in London to the drummer for the grunge band, the Foo Fighters. What resulted in their tenure in the 1960s was an anticipation of every type of popular music to come after them. They pushed the genre of rock and roll so profoundly that there was space for it to remain the popular music in the US and England for the next 50 years, just from everyone picking up any small piece of what they introduced and growing it into an entire field of possibilities. As a rabbi, I feel that it is not always my role to have the answers, but rather to ask the right questions. And so I am turning to you to ask, what is your voice in Judaism? Is it meditation? Do you read Jewish novels or sing bim bam to your kids? Is it the familiar words of the Friday night service or a bagel recipe? The story of your family leaving Europe, Iran, Mexico? Or is your Judaism the reason you march on Harvey Milk Park? This holiday, I invite you to ask the question, what does your Judaism look like? And we promise to do our part. Cantor Cooper and I are weaving what is familiar with what is new. And among other things, we've carved out the first Saturday morning of the month for a hike and meditation at El Dorado Nature Center. Come and join us. Let's see how the space and media speak to us. One of my favorite stories that the Beatles tell about themselves was right around the time they were recording Rubber Soul. It's fair to say that the Fab Four were at the height of their popularity and career from that point through the next 5 years or so. Along with their success and fame came a significant amount of wealth, and between recording, press conferences, touring, TV shows, movies, writing, and practicing, they found some time to have fun. John had a big Rolls Royce, which he painted bright yellow. And in it, he installed tinted windows and, of all things, a megaphone. He couldn't really drive it, and anyone who's seen a picture of the myopic icon knows that he had glasses with lenses about as thick as they were round. Nevertheless, he used to cart the others around in it, bounding down the street with what we can only hope were bumpers on either side of the country roads. Except this night, only Ringo and Paul were in the car. Instead, they were chasing George down the street in his new car. 4 boys on top of the world, and they were playing, following George in the psychedelic behemoth, announcing over the loudspeaker, "It is foolish to resist. It is foolish to resist," as they bounded down the road and into the night. If nothing else, the story of the Beatles is a story of friendship. The band dissolved when the 4 grew into adulthood, became spouses and parents and away from each other. We are one community, and we can't innovate and preserve and live vibrantly in the same way by ourselves. We need to feed off of each other. Different generations, one inspiring and lifting up the other. One of the unique beauties of the synagogue is the way that generations can be in a shared space, with accidents and ideas that make way to movements, and so I know that we can work it out. Because, of course, we get by with a little help from our friends. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.